I think without further ado, I'll hand over to Gemma Buckland.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Helen's going to share slides for me. And the page has disappeared. Oh, there we go. Right, bear with me. So as Andrew mentioned, sorry, my slides have decided to freeze. Okay, I'm going to ditch that plan because I can't see the slides. Apologies for the slight technical hitches. Could you move on to the next slide, please, Helen? So as Andrew mentioned, I'm going to talk to you about the recommendations and findings from the Commission's final report. As Andrew said, the Commission was established in 2019, and that followed their awareness of a pilot that was being run by Cheshire Constabulary, delivered by Beacon Counselling Trust, which was looking at screening for gambling and then thinking about what the next steps needed to be in terms of how to support somebody who might be involved in the criminal justice system and have some relationship between gambling and their offence that they've committed. So the Commission had three relatively simple, on the face of it, questions to answer. What are the links between gambling related harms and crime? What impact do these links have on communities and society? And then what should be done? So the Commission concluded earlier this year, and as Andrew mentioned, I prepared the final report. So we brought together, could I have the next slide, please? We brought together the findings of various activities. So at the time in which we started, we found that there was a relatively limited evidence base. So the Commission called for evidence, a bit like a select committee would do, and also conducted a literature review. And those kind of early elements of the activities revealed that there was not very much evidence internationally or in the domestic context, so in England and Wales. So what we found was there was some research evidence around prevalence in some countries. There was some research evidence around particular interventions, but there wasn't anything really that helped us to understand what was happening in England and Wales. And the research that did exist was relatively limited in relation to gambling and the criminal justice context. So in order to enhance that evidence, the Commission undertook some research projects. There are 6 listed there, and I'll talk to you a bit about the findings of some of those, but they each have a separate report that it would be helpful for you to look at if you want to dive into these in more detail. And the Commission also conducted various oral evidence sessions trying to understand more about what was happening in England and Wales, to shine a light on the extent to which gambling was being considered as an element of people's offending behaviour, and then what should be done in order to support them to manage that need. You can move on to the next slide. So the findings centred around 3 themes. The first being the frequency and nature of gambling-related crime. The second, the impact of gambling-related harm and crime. And the third being the awareness of people involved in the criminal justice system and the responses that they currently or potentially could make towards people who are affected by gambling-related harm. So it's very difficult to understand the prevalence of gambling-related harms in the criminal justice system. There isn't really a concrete figure. There's not very much recording going on by criminal justice agencies, so questions aren't really being asked around whether or not there's any relationship between an offence and gambling. There's a significant reliance on self-reporting. So, for example, there is a question in OASIS, but that's more around finance and debt. And people are very reluctant to disclose that they have been gambling, and there might be a relationship between that and the offences that they've committed. that's also related to shame and stigma, which we'll talk about a bit more in a bit more detail, and also to do with the victim perpetrator relationship, as we put it there, in that so often the victim, so what the source of funds, I suppose, is somebody who is in a close relationship with the person who's perpetrated the gambling related offence. And so that might be because they're an employer, or it might be because they're a family member, or it might be because they're involved in some kind of voluntary activity with them. And this is a quote that illustrates just basically, it's not going to be something that screams out at a practitioner straight away. People are not going to be disclosing this straight away, and it's not until you start trying to unpick what's happening that you might identify that an offence was related to gambling. Next slide, please. So this illustrates the frequency and nature of crime types that came from an FOI study that the Howard League conducted with police forces in England and Wales. And we just wanted to sort of show this to you because it might be helpful for you as practitioners to kind of reflect on the sorts of offences that you would think would be related to gambling, and actually you'll find that there's a whole plethora of offences that can be related to gambling, and it wouldn't be necessarily just those kind of theft and acquisitive offences. Obviously, a significant one there is around violence against the person, but there are many other offences related to gambling. So it's really important, as I've already mentioned, to kind of look underneath what's going on in order to try to understand the extent to which there might be gambling related to an offence. And also more widely, it might well be that a person who's in contact with the criminal justice system might present with another type of offending behaviour, but there is also underlying gambling that is playing into what's going on for them in their lives. Next slide, please. So there's a very complex interplay between crime and gambling harms, and that's not limited to people who have an addiction or a disorder. So there is what's called a gambling disorder, which is a clinical diagnosis, and we found that it's important to kind of look beyond that because there's such a spectrum of harms related to gambling, and it might be that somebody doesn't meet the threshold for being diagnosed with that clinical disorder, but there are other things that are going on that mean that it's important to look at gambling in the context of offences. As I've just mentioned, the policing research revealed a much wider range of offences than people necessarily think are related to gambling, but also a greater propensity to anger and frustration leading to offences, to the challenges that people face in relation to why they might be gambling, because we found from the lived experience research that people's emotional states typically increase the propensity for them to be potentially undertaking harmful gambling behaviour, and then also has a negative impact on relationships once that comes to light. And so it's really complicated in terms of how you unpick what impact gambling is having on offending. And there are also really strong links with other social vulnerabilities and with other addictions like drugs and alcohol. The other thing to be aware of is that people committing crime or having experience of criminal justice involvement who experience gambling harm might well not recognise it initially. We spoke to lots of people who felt that their gambling behaviour was under control, that gambling is part of normal social life, and they didn't recognise that it was causing the extent of harm that it was. And gambling debts can accumulate very rapidly, and we also found from the lived experience research that it's often kind of the first time that somebody's come into contact with the criminal justice system or committed an offence, and that there's often been limited other involvement in offending. So it's important not to make assumptions, I think, around the people that you might be coming into contact with, in terms of where they're of the relationship with gambling. And the other thing to bear in mind is that quite often the behaviours kind of, as they escalate, and they can go on for quite some time, escalating to a degree, but people are managing them by finding money from various different means, like credit cards or loans or borrowing money from other people, and then something happens to tip them over. They're not able then to rely on those sources of funding, and that's when the criminality element comes in. And there's quite a significant relationship between the guilt that builds up around the volume of theft, for example, and then self-disclosure to the police. So quite a lot of the people that the Howard League spoke to, or the researchers commissioned by the Howard League spoke to, ended up disclosing themselves that behaviour to the police rather than it being revealed. So it can be hidden for a very long time. Move on to the next slide, please. I've already talked about the kind of shame and stigma. I think people don't see themselves as offenders, if you want to put it like that. They don't see themselves as being people who have a propensity for committing crime, because they haven't had that history, and that discourages people disclosing and help seeking. So even though I've just mentioned that people do self-disclose, it can go on for a very, very long time before that tipping point happens, and very often that is when somebody's in a very significant crisis and experiencing other kind of emotional harms, and relationships with family have broken down and things like that. There's quite a significant overlap between risk factors for wider criminal justice involvement and gambling harm, having said what I've just said. So that includes things like urgency in relation to the kind of volume of offending, impulsivity, and risk-taking behaviour. It is really complicated because there are so many different types of offences, and there's such a different range of kind of options for gambling. There are also structural factors associated with higher levels of gambling harm, and that includes the level of income, for example, social inequalities and discrimination. And I'd really encourage you to look at both the final report and the peer research reports to understand much more about the complexity of the interplay between all of those factors. Next slide, please. Thank you. So there are wide-ranging impacts of gambling-related harm on both individuals and on society. So they have, as I've mentioned, a significant impact on physical and mental health, on relationships, and that might be in relationships with employers, it might be relationships with friends, on intimate relationships and relationships with wider family members, and also with social networks. So people talk to the researchers about sort of withdrawing, I suppose, from social networks, or not having social networks in the first place that enabled them to feel comfortable and happy emotionally in their lives, and they therefore turned to gambling as some kind of as an occupation to sort of use their time, and also to sort of feel better about themselves. There are a number of groups affected by gambling-related crime. That includes current and former intimate partners, children, wider family members, and victims. And it's really important to think about how they interact with the criminal justice system as well, because we found that very often the people who are within the family, for example, can be seen as somehow having been colluding with the person who's been committing the offences, and they didn't feel as though they were adequately supported by criminal justice agencies like the police, for example, when people were being questioned. It was kind of, there was a level of kind of incredulity, I suppose, about the fact that these people might not have been aware of the extent to which, or aware at all of what was going on in terms of their sort of family finances. So there can be really significant emotional and practical implications. The term that is used typically is affected others. Some people don't like that term, but that's the one that we ended up using. And there's a real lack of tailored support for them when they come into contact with the criminal justice system, because that's an opportunity then to find ways to support them with what's been going on in their lives more widely, because the ripple effect of these types of offences are huge. We also found from the range of research that was done with people with lived experience that there were very different experiences and impact for people of different genders, ethnicity and religion. So that means like really taking an intersectional approach to looking at gambling related harms linked to crime is also key. Next slide, please. So moving on now to thinking about what's happening in the criminal justice system, we need to sort of bear in mind that this research commenced in 2019, and so there's been a shifting picture over the time in which the Commission was active. This research on sentencing took place relatively early on, so in 2020. And the researchers looked at sentencers' understanding and treatment of gambling related harms. And they found that while there was a kind of general awareness of gambling amongst sentencers, this research was done in partnership with the Magistrates Association, so we're talking about the magistracy largely. There was limited understanding about how it might relate to crime, and many sentencers didn't feel as though they'd seen any cases really where gambling was a factor in the offending. So in that sense, gambling related harms are very hidden in the courtroom. The researchers also found that there was a lack of understanding and training about how the issue should be dealt with. So if there were cases, what's the right approach in terms of sentencing and in terms of treatment? And is there treatment available? What should that treatment look like? And what sentencing options might be most viable for the court to use? There was also quite a significant variation, as you would expect, in sentencers' responses, and that's not unusual. But there was some real tension in terms of whether gambling should be seen as a kind of mitigating or an aggravating factor in terms of sentencing. And I think there's something more to do to really think about that, because in other forms of kind of clinical disorder, there that can be seen as a mitigating factor, but the volume of kind of fraud, for example, that can build up means that the kind of offence can look pretty serious on paper, but if that's related to a clinical disorder, then you know what should sentencers' response be? So there's something more to be looking at there, I think, in terms of sentencing outcomes or sentencing options, and how the sentencing process should approach gambling related offending. Can you move on, please? Thanks. So the next piece of research I want to talk about is in policing, and as I mentioned, the Howard League themselves did some FOI requests to police forces, and they found that in around a fifth of forces there was screening for gambling harms and other addictions, but there was significant variation in terms of who was screened, why people were screened, what screening tools were used. And there was also a range of partner organisations used that the police would refer into or connect to, both local organisations and national organisations. They also found that like 2 in 5, so 2/5 of forces didn't conduct any screening or display any awareness. So there's a real mixed picture there in terms of the extent to which this is being considered currently by the police. Again, sort of 2 in 5 did illustrate some awareness of gambling harm. So they might be identifying through a general assessment of needs and vulnerabilities. So that might be done through the assessments that take place in terms of risk in custody, and then the liaison and diversion schemes assessments, but that would have to be relatively visible to be picked up in either of those assessments. And some people also some in custody suites spoke of there being sort of access to leaflets when people booked in or on release regarding support for gambling harm. So there is awareness, and I would say probably since this research has was published, it's increased. There's a higher level of national interest now by the National Police Chiefs Council, for example, on what ought to happen in relation to policing and gambling related harms. But that was what we found at the time. Thank you. And wider kind of findings from the policing research were that there were a real lack of appropriate local services. So although there were some kind of pockets of examples of referral routes into local services, there wasn't very much provision. There were also significant challenges for custody suites in sergeants in identifying gambling harms, and how important it is for there to be a really well-rounded assessment, and the need to build rapport in order to help people to open up around what might be underlying the offending. Whether or not the custody environment is conducive to people feeling able to talk about what's going on for them in their wider lives is another kind of consideration. And I've already mentioned the diverse range of gambling crimes. It's also important to think about gambling harms as both a cause. So the fact that somebody's got involved in gambling means that they start committing offences related to the gambling, and also a contextual factor. So it can be that gambling is playing a part in people's lives as part of a much wider picture of offending, but also the kind of stresses that people are facing in managing their lives might be indicative of they might turn to gambling related to that, and that might be indicative of other social needs that they have. So there's a really strong relationship with other vulnerabilities. Where there is awareness training and where there is screening, there is demonstrable kind of success in the approach in terms of people being diverted into helpful pathways and there being positive outcomes as a result. And I'll talk a bit more about that later on. Next slide, please. In relation to prisons and probation then, so we looked at we talked to prisons and probation services about their own kind of knowledge of gambling, and we found that there's very little awareness and knowledge of gambling amongst staff, and also amongst other people who are in custody, and that there's a kind of almost total lack of support. Again, this piece of work was done probably 2021, so things have started shifting and there has been more interest in what support could potentially be available in prison for gambling. We also heard through the research that was conducted with people with lived experience of gambling in prison that recovery in prison is really difficult because of the gambling, because of the culture, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. And that there's a real lack of awareness and knowledge amongst probation staff as well as prison staff. Again, there's little tailored support linked to probation services, but that's increasing. And there was a feeling that there was that enhanced understanding among probation staff was key because of the role that probation have in providing pre-sentence reports. Move on, please. So a particular piece of work was undertaken with peer researchers to try to get underneath the kind of culture of gambling in prison. I think most people would be aware that it exists, that although gambling is not officially sanctioned, it's widespread and diverse in terms of the ways in which gambling occurs, and that it's accessed by both residents and staff in prison. The research revealed a real kind of, again, complexity in terms of how the role that gambling plays in prison environments. So for some people, it can be really they spoke of it as being a very positive experience, that it gave them some joy in the kind of mundane prison regime, that it gave them some meaning, It was a way of kind of engineering freedom, so making them feel as though they could partake in activities that were where they felt free. For some people, it was more about survival and finding belonging in a connection with people and validating friendship, so joining in because it felt like a way of making those kinds of connections, and in building communities. But more importantly, there are some kind of real harms as well. So it can be very linked to subcultures, and people having to sort of demonstrate that they're willing to engage in those kind of subcultures in order to belong. And it can also provide a form of currency within custodial environments. In terms of the harms, we heard from those people who experienced gambling related harms in custody that the harms are, again, are wide ranging and complicated. So that includes financial harms, the fact that it really almost pervades the culture of prison life. So if somebody comes in with having committed a gambling related offence, then it's very difficult for them to move away from that within prison. It can be it's very much, and I don't think this will surprise a lot of people, related to violence, mental health difficulties and other vulnerabilities, and can also result in quite significant, the opposite of the positives in terms of loss of connection, powerlessness, and kind of almost moving backwards in terms of rehabilitation. It's also an important finding to bear in mind is the fact that the harms are extended beyond the prison walls. So in relation to debts, for example, and those other relationships that the cultures that we're talking about, they extend beyond the prison walls, and they can, in terms of post-release, but also in terms of kind of the impact on friends and family. And for those people who, as I said, are already experiencing gambling related harms, it can be incredibly detrimental. And the fact that it's kind of openly happening but not sanctioned can lead to quite a lot of hidden harm. Move on, please. Thank you. So I just wanted to sort of capture where we are now. As I was writing the report, which was an early part of this year, so it was published in April, there was a lot of interest. So I think we probably moved on from it being emerging, but there are emerging examples in relation to practices linked to the police, courts and probation. Most of them, though, haven't been evaluated, although some of them are now starting to be, and I can talk a bit more about some of those examples in the Q&A. In kind of related to the fact that there's emerging interest, the knowledge and understanding of gambling disorder and wider gambling harms amongst health and justice professionals and the charities was poor, but it's increasing. And there's more interest in what are the potential care pathways and referral routes. As I said, there was a lack of screening or assessment. Where services do exist, there's a real capacity issue, so they're very small in scale. And in terms of clinical provision, NHS is trying to scale up its provision, but it's not widespread across the country. And then the charitable sector there are kind of pockets of commission services, but there's, again, not really a kind of national infrastructure or kind of regular commissioning routes that enable access to those kinds of services. And H&PPS is now seeking to better understand the prevalence, effective practice, and to develop a policy framework around this. So over the last year or so, might be slightly longer, and there may well be people on the call who are involved, H&PPS has kind of set up a working group to really kind of drive forward work on this and think about what might need to go into a framework. Next slide, please. So to conclude then, and I will then move on to talk about some of the recommendations that we made. In terms of our findings, I think gambling is highly relevant in criminal justice contexts. There are kind of harms that happen within the system, but it's also a causal and contributory factor to crime. And I think it's really important that practitioners and criminal justice professionals become aware of the really diverse and far-reaching nature and impact of gambling-related harm on crime, and the fact that it is a clinical disorder if it reaches a certain threshold. We think there are lots of missed opportunities to try to support people experiencing gambling related harms in the criminal justice system, and therefore, you know, we're kind of pushing an open door, I think, in terms of what we can do next with the findings. There's so much that can be done, but it's really important to understand the nuances of people's experiences so that you can work out how to support people effectively and to de-escalate the gambling related harms when they, at the point at which they start and before they get to that tipping point that I mentioned earlier. So enhanced awareness and understanding will improve criminal justice system outcomes in relation to diversion, sentencing and supervision, for example, and also has the potential to really improve access to treatment opportunities. So can you move on now, please, Helen? So in terms of where we want to get to, I think it's the same with any kind of health and social care issue. It's around raising awareness, trying to understand the impact of gambling on people, on people's lives, on people's mentality, on people's mental health, on their, you know, neurocognition as well, like how their brains are wired. It's important to improve awareness and signposting to gambling support and treatment services and work out how to align that with treatment options and particular criminal justice elements of the criminal justice process. So that might include, for example, using suspended sentences to enable treatment to be accessed. Think about how probation supervision can be used, or rehabilitation activity requirements or community mental health treatment requirements might be able to be used to support treatment. There needs to be a lot more community-based support and treatment services for people who are affected by gambling-related harms, and not all of them want to be involved in the criminal justice system. So it's important that access routes are found that are not necessarily via the criminal justice system. Another thing we found is that it's important to include the voices of people with lived experience of problem gambling and affected others, as well as understanding more from the therapeutic field, so the clinical elements of what needs to happen to support somebody who's experiencing gambling related harms. And both of those things would really enhance criminal justice practice. So it's really about how do you kind of tie all those elements together: the health, the social care, the criminal justice kind of elements of support. And there also needs to be greater consideration of gender and culturally specific support pathways and understanding what constitutes therapeutic best practice within the criminal justice system. There's very little research evidence on that. Next slide, please. So in terms of recommendations, I mean, building on what I've just said, it won't come as a surprise to you that we think there needs to be more screening, there needs to be assessment, and that needs to happen at multiple points within the criminal justice process. At the moment, there doesn't seem to be much in terms of picking up an addiction, and when that's identified, what needs to happen and how do you make sure that people who have reached that threshold in terms of the harms that they're experiencing are able to access an in-depth assessment from therapeutic professionals. And as I said, the NHS is really increasing the geographical spread of the clinical provision that's there, but it's figuring out how to sort of tap criminal justice pathways into that treatment as it grows and emerges. There's also a need to introduce guidance and training for criminal justice professionals. And that's something that HMPPS is working on, and for greater collaboration between criminal justice and public health agencies, so that we can think about what needs to happen at each stage of the criminal justice system in terms of, can we divert people? What support routes can we provide once people are in contact, either through sentencing or through probation supervision, or while people are in custody and then as they come through the gate. There's also a need to think about how to integrate lived experience voice and to co-produce services, and we come across some examples of that. And I think that's something that the charities that are working in this sector are really embracing. And importantly, there's a need to really consider how the nature of gambling in prison can be recognised and considered, and how you can kind of achieve some kind of cultural change on gambling within prison environments. Next slide, please. Oh, apologies, I've got a slight a slight overlap there. So some of the ideas that are in the report related to prison culture and gambling include the creation of resources for staff and residents, which could potentially be developed together, and for there to be co-designed gambling strategies within prisons and workshops that look at the kind of culture and think about what support might be necessary and how gambling can take place in a way that's that meets the kind of positive benefits that people mentioned, but is also safe for those people who are experiencing gambling harms. The other another suggestion was that, or recommendation was that it's really helpful to think about within the context of any kind of cultural change, planning or strategy, to work out how you can replace gambling as an activity. So what can people be doing instead? Because the research indicated that, it is used frequently and it is a way of people passing time, and it does have meaning for a lot of people. So what's going to happen if that's taken away? And we think it's also helpful, important to start mapping and understanding much more about existing practice. And as I said, I undertook that as part of the work that was done in the report, and I can share with you afterwards the kind of I've created some tables around policy and practice levers and where there are touch points with the system and what could therefore potentially provide a route into raising awareness, or there needing to be some training at that stage, or signposting or pathways into other services. Thank you. Next slide, please. So more broadly, there's also a need to develop a kind of much higher level strategic approach. So I've talked so far about, what practitioners can do and what services can do in particular areas or individual prisons, but there's also a need to develop a kind of broader strategic approach. The suggestions that the Commission had were to use gambling commission revenue. So those come from the gambling industry, but not because they are that big due to fines and things like that, and then that money can be reimbursed into initiatives that are able to support and prevent gambling harms. So they could potentially be used to fund local and regional criminal justice and health infrastructure around treatment and support, bringing in all elements of the system and thinking about, like, how do we create a network so that people don't fall through the gaps in the ways that we've found that they have done to date. And we think there needs to be a central drive from the Ministry of Justice and from the Home Office to signal, quite what a problem gambling related harms are within the system, and to ensure that support is given for funding a more systematic approach. And as I said, there's kind of a bit more of a bottom-up drive for that at the moment. So HMPPS is taking this forward. We think it would be helpful if the kind of higher level government agencies were also working together to really kind of identify this and signal what needs to happen, what needs to change. And the proposal that the Commission made was that there should be a national board of senior representatives from criminal justice and health agencies, which includes lived experience representation to drive this forward across the whole criminal justice system, not just in prisons and probation services, for example. So thank you. I think that's the end.
Thanks, Gemma.
Thanks.
We're now going to hear from Ben.
Hi everyone, let me just share my... Can you hear me okay? I'll put these on. Can you...
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. So, just a quick introduction from myself, sort of who I am, why I'm here, sort of thing. So, yeah, my name's Ben, 34 years old, and I have experienced gambling-related harm for 14 years, and that part of that 14 years experience was actually handing myself into the police, and currently still going through the criminal justice system. So I will make reference to my case ongoing, but will not give details, obviously, because there is a live investigation going on. So I've been in recovery for 3 years and 1 month. But I always like to say as well, I know Gemma just spoke around the stigma and shame. I am more than that. You know, I am not just someone in recovery. I am not just someone going through the criminal justice system. I am a person as well, you know, and it's really important, especially as we highlight people going through the criminal justice system, yes, to identify gambling related harm, but to actually look at them as individuals. So gambling harms and the criminal justice system for me, as I said, I'm currently going through the criminal justice system and have been going through the criminal justice system since August of 2020, where I almost hit my rock bottom and I had no way out, or escape from gambling. And the options sort of were, and I'll give a sort of trigger suicide warning here, they were hand myself into the police to escape from gambling or take my own life. And I took the option to hand myself into the police. So experiences I've had to date, when I left the police station, I had absolutely no screening, no signposting, no support, no identification of anything gambling related. And actually the officers who I come into contact with on that occasion actually made a bit of a joke and banter. You know, I've built myself up that this is the worst experience of my life. And I'm coming in here and they said, God, you must be really clever. How did you get away with that? You know, really sort of making a joke. And I was broken. So not a great experience in terms of people's empathy and understanding to what I was going through. Released under investigation, which when I come to sort of my personal changes and recommendations later, I will look at, you know, sort of that process in itself being a very prolonged one for anyone experiencing gambling related harm. I've experienced a lengthy investigation time, so that has added to me accessing other public health services. So yes, you know, sort of police and criminal justice system are doing what they're doing, but in turn of me being held in this system, I've had to access mental health services, counselling, medication. I haven't been able to access employment, which means I'm stuck in the benefit system. So it's an extra financial strain to other services with me being held sort of in the criminal justice system. As I said about empathetic understanding, a sort of a lack across board really, and even to me, I sat in an investigation voluntary interview, and the officer who was interviewing me asked me, in inverted commas, "Are you still in recovery?" Like this, as if to make, you know, it's a joke, it's a farce. Why is this the reason for the fraud that you committed, etc. I've seen massive inconsistencies across my investigation. So to date, we are on the 9th officer in charge of my investigation, and obviously prolonged a 3-year, 1-month investigation. So across those 9 officers in charge, I've had minimal communication. I've been actively or proactively emailing into sort of the local police force and officers in charge to say, where's the case at, what's going on, I want to move this forward, I want to get, you know, a closure in sight. And I've had emails that just say no significant advice can be given at the moment. Not, hi, how are you, do you need any signposting support, how's your welfare? That's it. So very minimal lack of communication. And even to date, you know, I've chased the case recently and there's absolutely no end in sight. Nobody can give me a charge date. Magnitude of delays across the CPS, you know, giving their charging advice, and that's all I've been told. And the gambling legacy harms, which is something really important, is those, you know, for me, being able to get into a relationship. I have to explain to people that I'm going through the criminal justice system. New social groups, I'm going through the criminal justice system due to gambling harms. Trying to seek employment, people do make a judgment, even though there was that sort of ban the box. So yeah, that is very much, you know, the legacy harms on there for me that I'm experiencing from that. So I, as I said, left the police station, had absolutely no support, nowhere to turn, nowhere to go, absolutely completely unsure. And the impact of lived experience and peer support, so I am a peer supporter myself now through the charity Bet No More, and this started 3 months after I left the police station, and I called the National Gambling Helpline, and GamCare provided me with amazing therapy and said, We really think you'd benefit from speaking to an individual who is, you know, similarly in your situation, who has been through this process. And it was the best thing that ever happened to me. It was completely life-changing, to the point I still access that service now and obviously volunteer for that service now. It installed in me hope, empowerment, authenticity, you know, that recovery is possible and that there is a life after experiencing gambling related harm. I have an ability to remain grounded now in huge times of uncertainty. You know, I have no idea what's going to happen in my future. There is a prospect still of, you know, a custodial prison sentence, but by having peer support, individuals around me who have been through the criminal justice system, who are in employment, who are giving me their sort of stories and tips of how to cope, it's actually what keeping me alive, you know, at the moment. So as a peer supporter, for me, working as a peer supporter, what current themes do I have? And I think sometimes when we talk about gambling related harm, what comes to people's mind is worst case scenario like mine. People are hitting their rock bottom, but actually there's a broad scope and spectrum of gambling harms that link to the criminal justice system. That's those that are living experience at risk, you know, of developing gambling harms, those that are experiencing harms, and those that have already sort of, you know, the end scope. And I come across individuals almost weekly who will say to me, yes, I've had thoughts of committing theft, fraud, stealing from my employer. You know, they don't act upon this because what they've done is they've reached out for support, and in turn they're having that early intervention and prevention, which is so important in picking up, you know, the signs of people experiencing harm. A lot of people that I work with who are actively going through the criminal justice system, or have been through, have all said about the lack of support, and signposting is hugely prevalent, that actually people were unaware of where to send people to. And I will come on a bit later to talk about the National Gambling Support Network, which is a regionalised support network across the entire of GB, which really I think the criminal justice system should now be tapping into signposting and support people in across there. People are left in their darkest times with no direction and unable to move forward is a very common theme. You know, this uncertainty, sometimes that shame and stigma in itself will then relay, you know, as we talked about the affected others, they will lose friends, family, colleagues, jobs, you know, all through the act of committing fraud or theft, etc. And people have nowhere to turn, and they've had no positive experience of the criminal justice system. I put on here the judge's ruling in a divorce case. This is just one that I come across, and I know that is more common law than sort of criminal justice. But just to sort of highlight again, as Jen was talking around the mitigating factors, a lot of individuals I work with who are going through divorce, if they're the ones who have experienced gambling related harm and the divorce is sort of due to that, that will not be taken into consideration in a divorce case. Inconsistency in sentencing. So this is something that I monitor myself very closely at the moment, ahead of my potential future of going into court myself. And there is no consistency at all in sentencing, and this is the message that I get from others as well. You know, I can see many cases across a period of time, and some will have suspended sentence, some will have no sentence and be sent off to probation, some will have a no sentence and come back in 12 months. You have the opportunity to go away and do XYZ, and others are sort of straight custodial sentences. But even in the custodial sentences, there's no consistency in sort of time of people are being sent to prison. Gambling within prisons, I know Gemma touched on that as well, and that is a common theme, that actually when you're in prison, you have absolutely no access to any form of support. You know, that is in the community. If people are having suspended sentence or if diversion schemes, you know, there is Gamblers Anonymous, there's peer support, there's far more access to people recovering in the community than in prison, and also the culture in prison of you know, gambling for, you know, touch-up items, etc. And also I've had a couple of individuals who said that the weekly activity in prisons is bingo. So, you know, when people are in recovery and that is the only thing to do, that's very sort of difficult. And people's emotional and physical rock bottom, you know, literally the worst place. So where do I think peer involvement support fits into the criminal justice system? I think that it needs to be involved across all levels: peer support, recovery coaching, or lived experience involvement. And I'll just use my example. If somebody was there at the police station or within 24 hours that I could have contacted to say, this is the process, this is what's going to happen, because actually I'm one of those individuals that's never ever been in touch with the criminal justice system. As I walked into the police station that day, I was naive to think that I was going to get arrested, put in a cell, and taken straight to prison. So when I was let out, that was quite a shock to me. So actually having somebody at the police station during this waiting time, as well as a bit of sort of moral support, you know, this is what's going to happen. Having contacts with legal teams and solicitors, that was a whole, you know, rabbit hole for me to go down. Through any research, probation and pre-sentencing, through the whole court proceedings, having peer support and, you know, a hand to hold there, and post-prison and sentence. I think it's really, really important to have that post-prison, because community integration is really important, and ensuring people access community charities and support networks to stop a relapse on them coming back out, and to stop reoffending sort of behaviours. So from my experience, what do I feel sort of needs to be changed? Gambling needs to be a firm mitigation within courts. You know, Gemma spoke about, you know, is it an aggravating or mitigating factor? At the moment, I mean, my legal team have advised me for my case that actually it is not a mitigating factor still in courts, and it's almost a bit of a judge lottery on as to what judge you get on the day as to how they view it, which I think is totally wrong. There needs to be a consistent approach in terms of sort of how this is viewed within the court system. Mental Capacity Act, I've put this on here, and I know sometimes we talk about sort of diminished responsibility of individuals, and especially pathological or disordered gamblers, you know, with that diagnosis. But for those that haven't got the diagnosis or don't reach that quota, they are still experiencing a lack in their mental capacity to make an informed choice. So for me, you know, when we look at sort of mental health conditions, etc., it will be, can this individual make an informed choice? Now, I will refer back to my own lived experience. If someone was to ask me, and in relation to gambling, there's no way I can make an informed choice. So that really, for me, needs to be taken into consideration across the criminal justice system. Diversion schemes, I will come on to in a second in terms of diversion schemes, but I think that really needs to be looked into. A sentencing guideline reform. So I think now we need to move away from sentencing individuals of gambling harm with fraud by abuse of position, fraud by false representation, etc., etc. And actually now what needs to come in is gambling related harm fraud. You know, a set of guidelines that are specific to that. Addiction courts, if we look to our friends in the US, you know, they are a bit ahead in terms of this, and they do have specific addiction courts. I think that will help in the reduction of getting people through the court system, having specifically set up, and also breaking down the sort of shame and stigma around gambling. Because for me, I'm under no illusion that potentially when I go to Crown Court, I'm 3 years and, you know, a month away from the crime and rehabilitation and change. Yeah, I'm going to be dragged through the mud again when you know, this potentially goes out to media, etc. I think a huge reduction in investigation time needs to happen. Three years is far too long to keep anyone waiting in suspense. A release under investigation review needs to be done. I think that was probably one of the worst things that come into the criminal justice system, because there is there's no end date that police have to have in terms of investigation time, which I think is unacceptable, not just for individuals like myself, but actually for the victims of crime as well, and affected others who just want a bit of closure. Communication improvements need to happen massively in keeping people involved. Training, development and understanding of all staff. Now that comes from sort of the empathy, understanding harms and picking up sort of triggers to those. A whole societal change and view on the individuals. Now that for me really comes from the sort of public health approach and the social impacts having. which, yes, there's a national strategy, but this needs to be picked up at localized sort of regional levels as well. I just touched on the court press and stigma. I think, you know, that the judges should be able to say no court press in this case, because actually, like for me, I'm 4 years away from that. And I've got my confidence back. And, you know, for the first 12 months, I didn't leave my house of fear of being attacked, people making comments. I come off all social media. I literally was hidden away for the first 12 months. And now I'm potentially going to have to go through that again. I'm going to just briefly touch on Proceeds of Crime Act. For me, quickly here, you know, we need to look, is it the individual's responsibility to be paying this money back? Because this money has gone to industry. You know, the gambling industry have received this money. So, you know, do we have to do further investigations to go a step further now into Proceeds of Crime to actually look into industry and say, you know, you've received the money. Did you carry out anti-money laundering checks? Did you carry out affordability checks, etc.? Have you done your regulatory compliance? And if not, then should we then be targeting the industry to return that money because of their own failings? But that's a whole nother subject, and I won't go into that due to time. So diversions and pathway to recovery. And the reason why I want to talk about this is because if everybody was given the opportunity that I say opportunity, I took it upon myself, but the pathway that I've had, and this is just a smidgen of pathway. As I said, there is a huge national gambling support network across Great Britain. So I went through GamCare, Bet No More UK and Peer Aid, and then I went through a great organisation called Reframe Coaching, Epic Restart Foundation, and Gamble Aware. And through doing this pathway to my recovery, I've one, sustained recovery, gained confidence, have opportunities. And I think to myself, how many people are we putting into prisons who could, given the same opportunity, rehabilitate and change? And just to follow up on that, again, really to emphasize, you know, the non-need for putting people into prisons, giving them opportunity, diversion schemes. This is just a little thing of sort of what I've achieved. You know, I'm in my last year to qualify as a counsellor, qualified recovery coach and peer supporter. I've launched campaigns at Parliament this year. I chair the Strategic National Lived Experience Council at Gamble Aware, as well as sort of 2 research committees between LGBT and probation, lived experience panels. And I'm sort of in a collaboration with America at the minute as a specialist peer recovery support as harms across there emerge. So I've achieved that in 3 years of not being in prison. So if I can sort of do that, what can other individuals do? You know, we need to look beyond the label and the stigma of gambling harm, and actually see what has this person got the potential to do. Very quickly, as I've just touched on, whole system and public health approach. You know, gambling harm is now being seen as a public health approach, and this does require a whole system buying. And you know, why say this here? Gemma touched on, you know, a Home Office and a Ministry of Justice lead on this, and yes, I am in full support of the Gambling Act review that the government are taking place at the moment. But this is not just a DCMS problem. This is a cross-departmental government issue, and across all departments, you know, housing, levelling up, Ministry of Justice, criminal justice system, policy needs to be changed. So it's imperative that more national campaigns, local and regionalised, are done. And that finishes me off. Sorry, I was trying to get in time and everything there, guys. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Ben. That was a whistle-stop tour, but a very comprehensive one. We're going to now watch a short presentation by Lauren Smith.
Hi everyone, just wanted to join you briefly today just to give a bit of an overview about some great work that has been started in HMP Lincoln, where they've taken a whole prison approach to addressing gambling related harms. So I'm sorry I can't be there with you today, but hopefully this is interesting and useful. So the background to the approach that HMP Lincoln have taken is that they were starting to recognise that perhaps gambling might be a factor in some cases of debt accruing in prison. And they've been liaising with myself and other colleagues and psychology within the prison to look at what information was out there in terms of crime and gambling related harms and how that might be impacting in prison. And so they used some of the evidence that was out there, the evidence from the Commission, the reports that have been done, and also an additional paper around sort of the prevalence and availability of gambling within prisons as well, to inform what they've now adopted as a whole prison approach, which as far as I know is quite unique in terms of prisons in England and Wales. So to give you some more information about the approach, it is led by the Safer Custody team, so by the head of Safer Custody. And the first the sort of starting point to the whole prison approach was to set up a bit of a steering group, and the steering group meets regularly and includes safer custody, healthcare, education, resettlement have now joined the group, children and families team, drug and alcohol recovery service, specialist provider, so GAMCare are on the calls for that, psychology, and then also academic input as well, to keep the approach sort of embedded within the evidence. The steering group meets fairly regularly, and there's a real emphasis on keeping that group going in order to keep the momentum behind this whole prison approach, rather than it being something that is started with the best of intentions but falls by the wayside. So that momentum really is there behind it. Then the next thing that the prison did in terms of taking this whole prison approach was to put a clear statement out about what the prison stance was in relation to gambling in prison and gambling related harms. So it was recognised that sometimes it's quite confusing whether gambling is or isn't allowed in prisons, and so they put out a statement to say that gambling is prohibited, and so it shouldn't be sort of facilitated and encouraged in any way. However, if somebody came forward and disclosed gambling, they would be supported in that disclosure and supported to access support available. To complement that, there was also the provision of staff training, and this is ongoing. So GAMCare have been in and provided training sessions to all of the staff. So Lincoln has a real nice training approach where they do something called speed training, which is kind of mini bite-sized face-to-face training courses, and awareness around gambling has been incorporated into that training approach. Then there's also been training of prison reps in education, for example, so people in prison who are working in positions of responsibility and who naturally support others anyway have been trained around gambling awareness so that they can then support other people. And then also in terms of what's been done on a practical basis in terms of that contact with people in prison, everybody has been asked about gambling during their induction. So on day 2, just after they've arrived, and then 3 months later, it's embedded into the key worker programme. And then they're also due to be asked prior to release from prison as well about any gambling that they might have experienced. And that's to give multiple opportunities for people to disclose that they might be experiencing gambling related harms. People might not be ready to disclose on the first occasion, they might not recognise it on the first occasion. So it's just about providing multiple opportunities to have that conversation with people. And then obviously if somebody does disclose and they request support, there are those referrals to a specialist provider, so out to GAMCare where required. And then there's been a clear policy, so all of this prison approach, all of this information has been put together into a clear policy that's been devised by a member of staff from the Midlands Psychology Service. And the policy covers things like gambling related harms, what does it look like, how to recognise it in people, how much of an issue is it potentially within prisons, what it looks like, and then that signposting and support, where to record information and how to do that sensitively, and also staff support as well. So it's a pretty extensive approach. It is early days still, so it's still gaining momentum, but the fact that all of this has been put in place in a relatively short period of time, I think can only be a positive thing. So the next steps, obviously the steering group will continue meeting, we'll continue developing the approach, and we've applied to do a piece of research just to look at how this is landing with people in prison. What do they want from an approach? How much of it is needed? And to build a bit of an evaluative approach as well. So that's it from me. Hopefully that was useful. And if you've got any questions, then feel free to get in contact. Thank you.
So there we have Lauren's presentation, and we're now into the Q&A. As Helen has put in the chat, if anyone does have a question that they'd like asked, please do pop it in the chat box and we'll pick up on it. But I do have a couple of questions of my own for Ben and Gemma. And we did hear a very inspiring presentation from Ben about his own experiences and the work he's been doing. And that does prompt my first question, which is, in terms of HMPPS, what can HMPPS do to include and utilise the expertise of people with lived experience, do we think? Don't know if you want to start, Ben.
Yeah, for me, it's, you know, gathering all information and data from sort of start to finish, having people there at every point possible to ensure that, one, we can pick up and identify harms, we can learn from sort of past experiences, so it's not just sort of current processes going on, but actually what can we learn from what's happened, how can we improve, and as much as, you know, we can sit and learn things from textbooks, for, you know, which is great, for me there is no more valuable information than that of someone that's walked the walk, knows exactly what they've been through. So yeah, at all points throughout the whole sort of prison and probation service, lived experience should be on hand. I feel that there should be a designated service now in which offers pre, during and post support, and, you know, community integration. And it was good to hear that that is sort of in the works, or the start of you know, the national sort of board recommendation from the Howard League. So over to you, Gemma.
Thanks, Ben. Actually, HMPPS has already got people with lived experience on the board that I mentioned that they have set up to try to work out what they're going to do about gambling for prisons and probation services. And I think that's a really, you know, excellent signal there. That's happened from the outset, and hopefully that will set the tone for the work that they do as well. In my mind, I think, yeah, as Ben said, at all levels, and for me that means at that strategic level, so the board that's trying to work out a way forward, and then also within research that might happen in relation to anything that's evaluated, or in getting a much richer picture of qualitatively of the experience of people who are engaging with criminal justice agencies. And we found that peer research models do work well. However, it's still not easy to find people and reach people through that kind of model. And we think, you know, lots more work needs to be done in order to make sure that we're really hearing from everybody who's experiencing gambling related harms. And then in service design, so in terms of what ends up being delivered, I think there's a really strong role for co-production there. And then obviously in relation to the actual support that's delivered, so peer support, but also I think on the board of those services and in the creation of any interventions, etc., that actually lived experience ought to pervade the whole gambit.
Thanks, Gemma. Thanks, Ben. Lauren was talking about quite an interesting example of good practice going on in a prison.
Yeah.
Do either of you, I'm particularly looking at you, Gemma, here, have any other examples of good practice that you think are worth flagging?
Well, happily, in the back of the report, and I'll quickly share my screen, there was a whole table of emerging practice, I think we called it, or something along those lines. And we decided against calling it effective practice because I think we don't know yet, unfortunately. Hang on, let me just share my screen. As I said, there's not a great deal of evaluation as yet. So in the back of the report in Annex C, can you see this? It's
maybe zoom it up a little bit.
Yeah, so I'm zooming in now. So I've produced this table, and it was the most accurate snapshot I could get at the time. It is relatively fast moving. I think there was a lot going on in terms of who needs to be doing what. As I said, the NHS services are kind of expanding, and GamCare is extending the provision that it's making, and Gamble Aware is also thinking, and Gamble Aware are the people who are responsible for kind of creating the infrastructure for services to exist and for more research to happen and all of those things. So they're really thinking about this. So I broke down the table to sort of, very crudely speaking, the criminal justice process. So there are things that are happening almost everywhere. In terms of assessment and screening, training and guidance, support and treatment. And then in my mind, data is really important to try to understand what's actually going on. And then I've got these cross-cutting issues at the bottom. So if you want to have a look at specific examples, I would commend you to the back of the report, Annex C, and then also speak to the team that are involved in the HPPS kind of advisory board, which is being led by Steve Johnson Proctor, to find out what they're doing to try to sort of bring this together, because I'm aware that, sorry, I'm just going to stop sharing now. I'm aware that there's quite a lot of work being done internally to try to do mapping as well, alongside what I've already done. And try to understand also what could be tweaked in terms of existing interventions and programs that are offered internally to make them more relevant to gambling related harms.
Ben, anything you want to add to that?
No, I'm. I think from my experience to date, as I sort of spoke through, apart from the amazing work that the sort of charities are putting into supporting individuals, which is good practice, I can't really comment on internal good practices at this time. I haven't seen any.
I mean, I should say something about the Howard League and our involvement in the commission, which we obviously ran for several years. We are moving into a new strategy, and we've taken the decision that as an organisation, the kind of pressing priority that we have to be doing something about is the state of prisons more generally at this moment. And yeah, I mean, almost every week now there are really very worrying concerns about what's going on in prison, and obviously the issue of prison capacity and the projected rise in the prison population. What that means in terms of our involvement in this work is that we are moving on, for the time being, from the space, this very interesting intersection space between criminal justice and gambling harms. But we do hope that the Commission's report has basically set out a map for others to take forward. And indeed, we've heard from Gemma about the group within HMPPS who are doing work, academics that we commissioned as part of our work, like Lawrence Smith, are continuing to show an interest and want to publish in this area. So yeah, we feel we got a ball rolling, or at least helped to get a ball rolling, and it is there for others to take forward. We are doing some post-publication initiatives like this event to just help to make sure that that is the case. This is a long-winded way of getting to my next question, which is that in terms of the Commission's findings, what do our panelists think are the top priority or the top 3 priorities in the Commission's work and findings that do need to be taken forward by others? I mean, Gemma wrote the report, so she will have strong views on this, but I'm interested in, Ben, your views as well, as someone who's actually got experience of going through the criminal justice process right now.
I've always found it really... Oh, sorry.
No,
Ben.
go for it. No, you go first.
I've always found it really hard to pick when I got immersed in a policy area, because I just think, oh, well, it all needs to be fixed. However, I shall. So I think we really need to get to grips with what the local commissioning arrangements need to be to support whatever activity is going to take place in prisons and probation. And that's about linking up health, social care and justice, and making sure that the clinical provision is there for people who need it, and then the social support and the mental health support and therapeutic approaches are available as well. And I think it's really important that there's a review of the sentencing framework and the extent to which that is capable or could be capable of better kind of understanding the fact that, as Ben's mentioned, there's so much time that seems to the criminal justice process takes so much time to happen, and there's a huge amount of growth that happens in the meantime, and access to treatment and all of those things, and what should be the implications of that, and then what's the best sort of kind of pathway in terms of sentencing for people. Could mental health treatment requirements be used, and if so, what would that look like? Could deferred sentencing be used, and what would that look like? Suspended sentencing. And I think, again, as we've spoken already, there's a real need to improve the evidence base. So what does work, which of these approaches are actually demonstrably having different outcomes for people. There is also a NICE guideline in production, which I think is important to mention. So I think that will hopefully, once it's published, drive some of that, figuring out what needs to happen at a local level in terms of commissioning, and in terms of the various touch points in the system and how people should be supported.
And for me, the top one for me is, Gemma's just touched on it there, is around sort of the sentencing, the inconsistencies in sentencing and diversion schemes. Just over the last 6 months alone, I've watched 3 amazing individuals who have put everything they possibly have into their recovery, rehabilitation, really sort of transforming, get sent to prison, and for me, it just calls into question, I think, what more can these individuals do? And the role for me, of any sort of prison and probation service is rehabilitation. So if people can evidence the fact that they are being rehabilitated, why are we sending them to prison? Why are we taking them away from the support? So that review of sentencing, consistency, and just giving individuals opportunity, because as I say, these individuals, as now I class myself, to be great contributors to society, volunteering, helping so many other individuals not get to these points. And that needs to be reflected in mitigation and in sentencing.
We've got an interesting comment. It's not a question, but it is an interesting comment from Heather Wright in the chat. Heather says, hello, the current assessment system OASIS is undergoing a review. I have asked, and there will be a question about gambling in the new question set. It asks whether they are affected by gambling, so whether they are directly affected due to gambling themselves or due to a close family member. Gemma, do you want to give any response to that in terms of how useful that would be?
I'm really pleased to hear that, because as I mentioned, the only way that there's access into that now through OASIS is through asking about debts. And so I think that's a massive step forward. I think, obviously, then what? It's the question, though, because it's great to do the screening, but then what needs to happen, and how can people best be supported if they do disclose? And it's interesting that they've got are they directly affected due to gambling of a close family member? And I think there is also something there about, it might not necessarily be a family member. I think you might need to tweak that question and broaden it to a degree, because I think there's quite a lot of literature around so-called affected others, and it's not necessarily close family members. I've forgotten the thread of where I was going, but I think if you're going to ask that question in particular, what's the infrastructure for supporting people who are affected others, if it's not, and I think there's also there's real scope there then to explore that kind of much wider dynamic that I mentioned, in terms of how gambling can be a factor in all sorts of different elements of a person's life that might bring them into contact with the criminal justice system. That it's not just a direct relationship with gambling and crime.
No, and I think it's important that if the practitioner does then identify this as an issue, I mean, it's probably better to say that the review of Oasis is a project that will take some time. That will, you would probably know that. But it's better to signpost to a specialist agency, and our 7-minute briefing does have information around where you can signpost, because I would much rather see the expert, if you like, support, through the channels that you've been saying about, Ben, than try and not get it right because it is an addiction. It's not, I would like to think that I would be there supporting somebody with any of the other addictions, alcohol, drugs, for example, and then getting that badly wrong. And it probably is one of the ways that we should bring in our partnerships, and we have the health and justice coordinators now. So I'm not an expert on this, but I just thought I'd share that, and I will pass back the affected others as better as a wider scope for that. Not that I'm a formal person to have that influence, but I'll give it a go.
Thank you, Heather.
It's great.
No bother.
I think Joanna Luck has got her hand up. Joanna, if you want to unmute.
Sorry, my chat function is not working for some reason. It's just doing a little timer. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, so I had a couple of thoughts, but one was a question about neurodiversity and specifically about ADHD, because I think the stats are something like 20% of problem gamblers have a diagnosis for ADHD, and those that don't have the diagnosis might meet come near to the thresholds because of obviously issues around risk, impulsivity. I just wondered, because obviously when we do Oasis and things, we can pick up on some of those traits, and whether it's worth that being part of the screening as well, as to get people thinking about that group. Obviously not to sort of say that all that group are going to have those risk factors, but it might be relevant.
Have you got anything?
It's not really a question. It was just a question about neurodiversity.
I agree.
Been raised. Yeah,
I agree, and I think I wasn't very specific in my presentation. It goes into much more detail in the report, but that intersectionality around, there's so much overlap in terms of needs, and it's very difficult and actually may not be helpful to unpick all of those things in terms of what's contributing to the whole. But I think thinking about, if you know that somebody has got a neurodiverse need that might make them impulsive or more impulsive, then make sure you're asking that question, and you're not just asking that question once, you're asking it again and again and again. And I think that the NICE guideline, as I said, is in production, and it will be important to see what's in there in relation to the evidence base, and how much there is an overlap between that and other and other needs.
Thanks, Gemma. And there was just one last point. It's just really about staff training, because you were asking about priorities. And my reflection was just that actually asking the question to someone who's used to deceiving others and keeping it on the down low is ineffective if they're not able to kind of create a genuinely safe environment and show that understanding of what the issue might be. So just, have you got any gambling issues, is an ineffective question. It's about the relationship. So for me, it's about training staff in a way that really helps them to understand what they're dealing with, and to remove some of that stigma and shame that keeps getting mentioned, which is absolutely at the root of this, I think. So thank you. That was all.
Yeah, and I think that's the same again with any other needs like that. I think it's around including neurodiverse needs, which might not be known about, but also, as I said about gambling, like, people might not realise that what they're doing is becoming problematic in their life, and that they are experiencing gambling harms. And so you do need to sort of tread carefully in terms of how you ask about it, and the sorts of things that you might need to sort of pick up on, in terms of, because it might manifest itself, as Ben said, in more of like a mental health kind of need that's emerging, rather than the financial issues or the the behaviour itself.
Thanks, Gemma.
And just for me on that, I think, back to the original point around sort of ensuring you have your localized collaboration in terms of support systems available. Gemma said there, screening's great, but what next? And making sure you have the confidence to really, pass it on. And we just quickly there spoke about stigma and shame. And I think that we can reverse stigma and shame. This is something I'm finding, is that actually the person asking the question is scared to ask the question of causing offence and putting unnecessary stigma on people. but you could just be the first person that's having that conversation, that's reaching out. It all starts with a conversation. So yeah, for me, just have the confidence to say, are you experiencing gambling related harm? You know, are you experiencing gambling addiction? And just repeatedly keep asking that. As Gemma said, you know, the first time round, if somebody asked me, I would say no, but you can read a lot of somebody's body language, you know, if it is sort of over the top. So yeah.
Just to add, there's some really interesting, also in the annex to the report, there's some really interesting kind of timelines of people's lives and the touch points that they had within the system, and where there might have been opportunities to ask questions that weren't asked, but also kind of at what stage it kind of shines a light on at what stage people do feel ready to sort of disclose, and what you're trying to do obviously is do that before a crisis it hits crisis point in whatever way.
Thanks, Gemma. And I think we are coming up to 11:30 and the end of the event. So I want to, oh, Heather, did you have your hand up? You put your hand down.
Oh, I did, because I thought you were going to conclude. I just wanted to just add as well that, you know, this could be an issue affecting members of staff that are doing the assessing. And, you know, it's not as visible, I would say, in my experience, as, you know, alcohol and drug misuse, like in the workplace. This is very, as you've already said, very, very hidden. And I just think equally, you know, you could be having people impacted. So I suppose in terms of, you know, line managers, you know, you might actually find that, you know, you're supervising staff, or you've got colleagues that, you know, this might be a problem for as well. So it's about having that empathy and knowing the sources of support for them as well. And also, if it's, you know, in terms of allocation of cases, it might be that your lived experience, you're at that journey and in recovery, that it isn't right for you to be doing that assessment of somebody else at that time. And so feel safe enough to share that and say, actually, you know, this isn't right for me to be doing this assessment at the time. I'm not in that space. It's not going to help my journey. So I think that's something we could be aware of as well.
Thank you, Heather. Well, I am going to wind up now. Thank you to our panelists, to Gemma and to Ben, and also to Lauren, who presented virtually and pre-recordedly, if I can say that. And thank you to everyone taking part. I mean, I think there is no doubt there are some really committed practitioners within HMPPS who have been taking this agenda forward. And it's great to see and great to hear from Gemma the latest on that. Yeah, thank you very much, everybody, for attending, and we hope to see you soon.